And as for the bunyip, it's largely a mythical creature anyway.
So a bunyip isn't a yowie?
No, there were a number of so-called bunyips. Some of them have turned out to be real animals, like the giant emu bunyip of Central Australia and Aboriginal folklore has turned out to be a 20-foot fossil skeleton recently. So we have physical proof of that now. Fossil remains. The classical bunyip was the Diprotodon. We know it existed from fossil remains. Every one of the Aboriginal bunyips has turned out to be a known fossil animal.
From the fossil record, there is a very unusual animal known as Palorchestes Azael, the marsupial tapir. Remember, there were two species of bunyips that the early settlers and the Aboriginal people talked about, and one of them was the long-necked bunyip that explorer Hovell found records of amongst the Aboriginal people along the rivers, and that's where that bunyip skull came from. And they described it as a long-necked, shy, herbivorous animal that only left the water at night to feed, and it had two large downward-pointing tusks. Those two front teeth identified as a diprotodontid, which means two front teeth, diprotodont. A diprotodont marsupial. And of all the herbivorous megafauna, and of course Australia was full of the most spectacular animals. We had, as you probably know, we had wombat-like animals the size of rhinos of several species. We had giant kangaroos that were 3 metres high with flat faces, so it looked like a human face on a 3 metre high kangaroo. There was giant goannas, there was marsupial lion, but on the cave paintings in Arnhem Land, illustrations of the marsupial tapir, Palorchestes Azael. So the marsupial tapir obviously survived. In a 1983 Australian Museum book, Tim Flannery, he's now the director of the South Australian Museum, wrote, "Perhaps no animal is as suited to have inspired the legend of the bunyip as Palorchestes Azael. Although a herbivore, it must have been a fearsome sight." In Riversley's, in a wonderful book on Riversley, which is that fantastic fossil site, 45 million year old fossil site in central northern Queensland, describes Palorchestes Azael as the size of a horse. Its body shape, it resembled no other creature known. It had huge koala-like claws. These claws were so large that it couldn't walk on land. Enormous, powerful forelimbs, a long ribbon-like tongue, and a large elephant-like trunk. And then, interesting enough, it had high-crowned teeth, complex teeth that would have withstood the abrasive effects of grass diet. In Katimakara, extinct vertebrates of Australia, and Katimakara is the Aboriginal name for the animals that once existed in the dreaming or the dream time, the giant marsupials, and they know all about the giant reptiles and all the other great creatures, and it states in that the remains of the marsupial tapir are rare everywhere, indicating that perhaps they were solitary animals, and this apparent rarity could have several causes. If one assumes that their rarity as fossils reflects their rarity as live animals, it is probable that they had a low rates of reproduction and occupied relatively large territories or home ranges. The front legs were permanently locked in a partly flexed positions, so the animal could not move its leg. It could move them, but they were permanently locked. And it had the hind limbs were delicate, so it had small hind limbs and huge, powerful forearms. The massive claws must have presented a problem to the species, assuming that they walked on the ground. Well, it certainly couldn't hang from trees. It was the size of a bullock or a horse. Very large animal with a smallish head, with powerful though rather immobile forelimbs that were locked at the elbows, claws that almost prevented the animal the ability to move about, and they may have been retractable, and somewhat delicate hind limbs. This would appear to hinder a large and heavy animal in a land full of powerfully built marsupial lions and giant goannas. The almost immobile forelimbs and great claws appear to be adaptations to a very specialised way of life that's got nothing to do with walking about or climbing trees. So I'm theorising that perhaps these adaptations were acquired for a sedentary aquatic lifestyle, where the giant claws and relatively immobile front legs gripped the substrate of sunken logs and rocks. Before we destroyed the aquatic ecosystems in Australia, and they're just in their death throes now, the rivers and lakes were were deep, clear waterways, incredibly ancient, millions of years old, and they were full of logs from fallen trees. There had been quite a different ecosystem to what survives today, full of remarkable fish, giant Murray cod, and with the buoyancy provided by water, this heavy beast with delicate hind limbs and immobile front limbs may well have found it easier to move about within swamps and marshes feeding on reeds. And so it's my belief that possibly the reason these giant clawed immobile legs were simply to grip onto the logs and substrate, and then the elephant-like trunk moved around feeding on the vegetation, the reeds, and it could easily move out of the water and then move back in if it was disturbed. With a limited habitat of wetlands, each individual would need a large territory, which it would define with far-carrying, bellowing roars, which the bunyip produced. And it would have been a rare animal with low rates of reproduction. The young Kinniprati observed by the Murrumbidgee in May 1847 was described as an awkward, shambling gallop. The forequarters of the animal very large in proportion to the hindquarters. Buckley said the back, which appeared to be covered with feathers of a dusky grey colour, we take it feathers, it probably meant fur, which may well have been the extensive mane that was so frequently described by Aboriginals and Europeans. And so what it seemed to be was a remarkable remnant of Australia's megafauna, a solitary aquatic herbivore on the edge of extinction, surrounded on all sides by predatory humans. And with the arrival of Europeans and their cattle competing for forage, the massive habitat destruction with widespread wetland drainage and silting up of the waterways probably exterminated yet another of our remarkable animals. And that is probably what the long-necked bunyip may well have been. There's marsupial tape here. That's an animal, remember, the size of a horse or a bullock. The giant claws there, the great locked forelimbs and the very smallish hind limbs. And it's shown here. The illustration of it always showed it feeding on bark, because it obviously couldn't get up to the trees to feed on the leaves, but bark wouldn't be a very good diet. I can't imagine it would run around eating bark. So I think in fact it was an aquatic animal. And it couldn't walk far on grass, it could feed on grass, it lived in swampy areas. So that is probably the bunyip, a very, very remarkable animal. And notice the similarities of the bunyip skull that was found, and it was actually exhibited in the Australian Museum and then thrown away. Fancy throwing something out of a museum. And you can see it's got just like that other illustration, it's got high forehead, nasal bones retracted backwards above low level of eyes, low set eyes, similar teeth to what the skull had, elongated upper jaw with two downward projecting tusks at the front as described by Aborigines. There's the skull of Palorchestes Azael. Very likely what the Australian Museum actually had was the one and only skull of the marsupial tapir. Remember, it was a stillborn individual, but Australian pride destroyed it. There's a possibility that the bunyip may still lurk within a 200-kilometre stretch of the Macquarie River between Wellington and Warren, and perhaps even in the Macquarie marshes, because between 1947 and 1973, the late Jack Mitchell received reports describing the animal sunbaking on the riverbank, swimming against the current and thrashing about in the water. And he states, and this was written in the Sydney Morning Herald, in every case the animal is the same. It swims in the river, makes a fearful noise, has a head like a calf and tremendous strength. Unfortunately, he passed away, and all of the maps and reports that Jack collected have gone missing, just like the bunyip itself. And these need to be retrieved, if possible, to honour the work of this fine gentleman and to increase our knowledge of an Australian icon.